Hi, everyone. Happy Saturday. Welcome and thanks for joining us. My name is Robert. I will be your host. Let me turn my camera on so you can see who I am. Hello out there. Thanks for joining us. Happy Saturday once again. This is Tubman Travels, 32 Underground Railroad Journeys with author and historian Jim Duffy. Let's go ahead and get started. If you are watching this live, we always welcome people to introduce themselves. So in the Zoom chat or the Q&A, you can let us know your first name, where you're connecting from, and have you visited any Underground Railroad sites. It's always fascinating to find out where people are joining us from and to learn more about them. And while I visited a number of Underground Railroad sites myself, there's many more out there that I haven't visited. So if you have any recommendations, feel free to put those in the Zoom chat or the Q&A or the comment section on Facebook. If you are watching live on Zoom, we don't do a Zoom demonstration in these programs. They're just very quickly. There's usually only a couple things that people ever have questions or run into trouble with. One is the sound and the other is the video display. So everyone will be in listen only mode or muted. But if you do want to raise or lower the volume on your session, you can check the settings locally on your own device. If you want to adjust the screen display so that the slides that we're showing and the picture of Jim or the video of Jim takes up your full screen, you can take care of that at your end by looking for something called either view or view options, and you can click off the side-by-side mode. Throughout our program, if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, opinions, ideas, perspectives, memories, etc., recommendations, feel free to also type those in the chat or the Q&A if you're watching live on Zoom, or in the comment section if you're watching on Facebook. This program is being recorded, so if you have to leave us early, or if you want to watch it again at some point in time in the future, or if you know anyone else that'll be interested in seeing this, it'll be on our YouTube channel, which is Washington, D.C. History and Culture. And for those of you not familiar with us, we're Washington, D.C. History and Culture. We're a nonprofit community organization, and we give people the opportunity to experience the history and culture of Washington, D.C. and various other places. My name is Robert Kellerman. I'll be more of your MC today. Jim is actually going to be the host. I'm the founder and director of the Washington, D.C. History and Culture Organization. And we're going to be talking today about Harriet Tubman, a name very familiar to many people, but not everyone is familiar with her amazing and inspiring life story and the fact that she's from Maryland, which is right next door to Washington, D.C. And so our special guest today, Jim Duffy, author and historian, you can't see it because it's blurred out. He wrote this great book that I read a few years back, Tubman Travels, 32 Underground Railroad Journeys on the Delmarva. So before I turn things over to Jim, just real quick introduction. He manages an excellent Facebook page called Secrets of the Eastern Shore. So Secrets of the Eastern Shore on Facebook, if you get a chance to check that out. And not only is he a historian, he's also an author. These are some other books that he's written in the past. First one, Eastern Shore Road Trips, 27 one-day adventures on Delmarva, and then Eastern Road Trips #2, 26 more one-day adventures on Delmarva. Let's see, Secrets of the Eastern Shore Guide. And he just put out a new book just a few days ago called You Wouldn't Believe 44 Strange and Wondrous Delmarva Tales. Now, these programs, we always get a lot of people joining us from outside the Washington, D.C. area. So let's real quick, this is Jim's book, the front and back cover. And we'll be talking about a place known as the Eastern Shore. And I noticed we have people joining us from London, Minneapolis, Australia, and various other places. So if you're not familiar with the term Delmarva, what that relates to is Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. So quick geography lesson, here's Washington, D.C., where our organization is based. Thanks to everyone joining us from other parts of the country and other parts of the world. Here's Delaware in yellow, Maryland in orange, and Virginia in green. And what I like about this area, it's really got an amazing history, and it looks very similar to the way it would have looked when Harriet Tubman was passing through here. It's still a very rural place. Sometimes when you visit historic sites, you kind of have to use your imagination to get a sense of what it would have looked like back when whatever event in the past would have taken place, but not so much here because this is such a very rural area and is not only unchanged from the way it was when Harriet Tubman was alive. And here's artwork from Jim's book. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Jim. Now, throughout his talk tonight or today, if you have any questions or things you want answered or more information on, feel free to put those in the chat or the Q&A in Zoom or the comment section on Facebook if you're watching us live. And what I'll do is once Jim gets to the end of his talk, we'll go and send some of the questions over to him. So with that, I will turn things over to our special guest host, author, and historian, Jim Duffy. Jim, it's all yours. Take it away.
Thank you very much for spending a little time with me this afternoon, evening, morning, midnight, whatever it is, where you are. With that generous introduction, I'm not feeling much of a need for preliminaries. What I would like to do is jump right in and tell you a story. It's a love story. Anyone who is traveling this Delmarva Peninsula, particularly the Maryland part known as the Eastern Shore, if you're traveling it, one of the main drags through it is a highway called Route 50. When I am traveling that, I come to an intersection just above the town of Easton. It's called Rabbit Hill Road. It's very, as Robert was just saying, a very rural area, lots of farms, a little forest. I imagine in my mind's eye that this is where a scene happened in the early 1800s. There is a hardworking woman, 50-ish, perhaps 60, walking with a young boy of maybe perhaps 7 or 8. That boy's name is Fred Bailey. No one knows where this particular moment happened. That's one of the things about the Underground Railroad. While the landscape, as Robert said, is very timeless on the Eastern Shore, this is not like going to Monticello, where you have things, you're walking on floorboards that Jefferson walked in, and in the building where he lived in, and touching things that perhaps Sally Hemings and other characters touched through the course of their life. Most of the buildings associated with the Underground Railroad, slave cabins, Underground Railroad stations, they are all gone, and you are left with the landscape. And you don't know exactly where things happened because it was a secret then, and it remains a secret now, the routes that they took and the houses that they stopped in. So I imagine that this scene described later in adulthood by the boy who was known as Fred Bailey as a child, happened here at Rabbit Hill Road. He's tired. He's very, very tired. They've been walking a long way from a place called Tuckahoe Creek. They still have a long way to go to get to a place called Miles River Neck. His grandmother picks him up and throws him over his shoulder like a sack of potatoes and carries him for a long distance. Now, I want to talk for a second, to set the stage here, about the roller coaster of life. We would think that being born into slavery on Tuckahoe Creek, living in a one-room cabin, not knowing who your father is, barely knowing your mother, she seems to have always been hired out, a practice that slave owners did. They would hire out their enslaved people to other farms. He had siblings, but he didn't know them either. He was the youngest, one of the youngest in the family, and the older siblings were all gone. He knew of them, but he didn't know them. And yet, when he reached adulthood, Fred recalled these first 6, 7 years of his life, not as the bottom of the roller coaster, but as the top of the roller coaster. He has this wonderful, nostalgic recollection of running through the woods and the fields around Tuckahoe Creek. He has a very funny section where he talks about the joys of not having to deal with the drudgery of school, because who wants a black boy to go to school, of not having to use silverware because they're not having to learn how to use proper silverware because they didn't bother with silverware, of not having to recite poetry to boring aunts and uncles like the white children did. And that section ends. The boy literally runs wild. He is, for the most part of the first 8 years of his life, spirited, joyous, uproarious, and happy. This journey that took him across this general area, and I imagine across Rabbit Hill Road, marked the end of that period in his life. His owner, Aaron Anthony, worked for a very famous historic family in Maryland known as the Lloyds. The Lloyds owned a plantation on Miles River Neck. When Aaron Anthony's enslaved children got to the age of 6, 7, 8, where they could handle simple tasks, he moved them to this plantation. So he went from the one-room cabin to this very unusual place on the landscape that he had never probably even imagined existed. It was a small city. There were 200 enslaved people working on this plantation. They had shipbuilding facilities and big kitchens and blacksmiths, and it was basically a small city. When they finally arrived at Miles River's Neck, what the boy's grandmother did was ditch him. Without telling him, she just left. Now, he had been introduced to some of the siblings that he didn't know. They tried to console him, but he was inconsolable. They were taking fruit off of fruit trees and things like that to try to give him something sweet to eat. And he sobbed and he sobbed and he sobbed and he sobbed. Ironically, the problem that Fred Bailey had on the Lloyd plantation was not so much with the evils of slavery and the violence of slavery. It was with a member of his own family. His Aunt Katie, she ran the kitchen where enslaved children got their food. She either took an intense dislike to Fred, or she decided he was in need of a really brutal version of tough love. And what she did, for reasons that are not clear, is she declined to give him enough food to eat. And what little food she did give him, she left him fend for himself while older boys regularly stole that food from him and pushed him away from his own food. And actually, this is more than some childhood mishap. He recalls foraging in streams for raw shellfish. He recalls fighting off dogs for discarded raw pieces of meat, discarded, spoiled pieces of meat that are in the garbage. This goes on for weeks. As you might imagine, he is horrified. And one day, the mother that he barely knew shows up out of the blue. He knew enough about her to unburden all of the troubles in his heart to her. And what that mother did in that moment was fix everything. It's unclear in the written materials in which all this is described, whether she simply read the riot act to Aunt Katie, or whether she went to the plantation powers that be and demand that something better happened. Fred Bailey later would recall, that night, I learned I was not only a child, but I was somebody's child. I felt prouder on my mother's knee than a king upon his throne. Flash forward 30-ish years. Fred Bailey has changed his name. He is now known as Frederick Douglass. He is one of the most famous men in America, Black or white. He is a renowned speaker. He is a renowned author. He is a renowned champion for the freedom of enslaved people. The culture that he is in now, the society, is very different from the one that he grew up on in those glorious first 6 years of his life on Tuckahoe Creek. One of the things of the many things that's different is they celebrate birthdays. He had no idea what date his birthday fell on. He didn't even know what year it fell on. In later life, he spent an enormous amount of time trying to figure out what year he was born in. And he finally came up with the wrong year, or at least most historians believe that he came up with the wrong year. But he wanted to celebrate his birthday, so he chose a birthday. And he chose February 14th. And the reason why, all these years later and all these accomplishments later, the reason why he chose February 15th is because he remembers while sitting on his mother's knee that night that she gave him a piece of ginger cake cut in the shape of a heart, and that she, while consoling him, called him my little Valentine. The difference a mother's love can make, even an absent mother in a brief moment, is really sort of an astounding place to start thinking about Frederick Douglass. Robert was very generous in introducing me as a historian. I'm more of a storyteller than a historian. I stand kind of on the shoulders of historians. But my book, Tubman Travels, the 32 Underground Railroad journeys, each journey tells a self-contained story from the Underground Railroad. And each journey is attached to a place that you can go visit on the Delmarva Peninsula. The stories that are in the book, for all the obvious and horrific reasons, paint a picture of America at her worst, with the abomination that was slavery. But the stories also, they don't just hint, they embody America at her best. The heroes in the book, for the most part, not completely, but for the most part, the heroes in the book are the cast aside of society, enslaved people. And yet somehow, the highfalutin values that America talks about, somehow it filtered all the way down to them. And they came to embody those values. There is no more powerful Horatio Alger up by the bootstraps story than the story of Frederick Douglass, and how he, for the most part, taught himself to read and taught himself to speak with remarkably little help. One of the contrasts between Douglass and Harriet Tubman is that Tubman remained illiterate for her entire life. Women were of lower status than today, even in those days. She had, as we'll see, a mental disability. And yet somehow she ends up channeling Patrick Henry. She says she tried to make her way to freedom and recalled trying to make her way to freedom. There are two things I've got a right to. These are death or liberty. One or the other I mean to have. So the stories in the book and the stories of the Underground Railroad are about people who did glorious things in inglorious times. I have 3 postscripts about that love story that I started with. The first, Fred Bailey, AKA Frederick Douglass, never saw his mother again. Second, in that same period, when he is discovering that he is not just a child, but somebody's child, he hears for the first time that there are places where slavery doesn't exist. The way that he hears this is through the family grapevine, because his Aunt Jenny and Uncle Noah made a run for freedom, and that word spread like wildfire through the Bailey family. It seems that they made it. I am unaware of people who have actually figured out what happened to Jenny and Noah. But there's one aspect of the story that I can't get my head around, and the fact that Douglass learned this at the same time he had this lifelong cherished moment with his mother. The thing that I can't get my head around is that Aunt Jenny and Uncle Noah left their kids behind. This gets at one of the things that I feel like I really learned in my work on the Underground Railroad. If you go out and you find a historic marker, that marker will say so-and-so was born into slavery, so-and-so had a rough go of it. And sometimes, when I say rough go of it, I'm talking about the worst of the worst. And so-and-so made a run to freedom. One of the things I learned is how difficult a decision that was, and how many people, unlike Jenny and Noah, decided not to go. And they decided to stay in slavery, and they did so because of their children, because of an ailing parent, for the same reasons that many people today are perhaps not living in the situations they would prefer to live in, because they have obligations, because they don't want to separate themselves from people they love and start over. And I ended up regarding the people who stayed in the same sort of heroic view, with the same sort of heroic mien about them as the people who ran. The third, postscript. The old Thomas Wolfe thing, you can't go home again, right? Frederick Douglass did try to come back home again. 1878, there's a statue of him in the town of Easton in front of the courthouse there. That is because he visited Easton in 1878 after the Civil War was over. He gave a speech at that courthouse called Self-Made Men. It's not one of his greater works, I don't think. It's kind of like an inspirational Tony Robbins-ish, giving examples of famous men who lifted themselves up by the bootstraps, much the way that Douglass did. What's interesting about his visit to Easton is what he did while not on stage. He hired a carriage to take him all the way back up to Tuckahoe Creek, where he spent those glorious first 6 years of his life. Now, I say that the buildings and things, the sort of physical remnants are all gone today. They were gone in Douglass's lifetime. The one-room cabin where he grew up was gone. His owner's farmhouse was gone. He had to tromp around in the woods in Tuckahoe Creek trying to figure out where it was he spent those uproarious and joyous first 6 years of his life. And when he finally found an old cedar tree that told him that he was in the right place, you see him with the shock of white hair and the fancy suits of clothes. And I imagined him wearing those things. And then he gets down on his knees and he digs up a bunch of dirt from off of Tuckahoe Creek, puts it in whatever he had, a little handkerchief, a little box, I don't know, and put it on display in his very nice home in Washington, D.C. It's easy to make too much of a story like that. It's not like there was a souvenir shop where he could buy a postcard or some other reminiscence of his time. There was a very limited selection of things that he could bring. But it's hard for me not to see that image of the elderly Frederick Douglass on his knees digging up dirt in front of Frederick Douglass, off of Tuckahoe Creek, as something akin to the Rosebud moment in Citizen Kane. I'm very briefly going to do a little didactic thing here, 4 little notes about slavery on Maryland's Eastern Shore. For the most part, the Lloyd plantation with its 200 slaves was an exception to the rule. There was not much in the way of Gone with the Wind style big Southern plantations on Maryland's Eastern Shore. Slavery was a small farm affair for the most part. A white family would own a very limited, had a small farm and would own a very limited number of slaves, perhaps 4, perhaps 8. The second note, slavery was very, very stable on the Eastern Shore for many generations dating back to the mid-1700s. So those Black families stayed with those white families, and generation after generation, that relationship of owner and enslaved stayed in place. Another thing that I learned while doing this work, I think that I came into this work with the notion that white families were established and had been here for a long time, while Black families were kind of newcomers, immigrants, if you will, even enslaved immigrants. But the Lloyd family, on that day when young Fred Bailey arrived at the plantation, the Lloyd family had been here for 5 generations. The historian Dixon Preston traced the Bailey family records as far back as could go, and it turned out that Frederick Douglass's roots also went back 5 generations. There was as you get closer to the Civil War, there was a movement many of you are probably familiar with called the American Colonization Society. The idea was it's never going to work out for Blacks in America. People who were opposed to slavery decided that since it was not going to work out for them, that they should be shipped back to Africa. Harriet Tubman was vehemently opposed to this movement, and she has just a fabulous quote. She herself was 3rd generation. Her grandmother was the one who came over from West Africa. Her quote is, "We are rooted here and they can't pull us up." Douglass, too, has a similar quote that gets back to that moment when he was digging in the dirt. "I am an Eastern Shoreman with all that name implies. Eastern Shore corn and Eastern Shore pork gave me my muscle. I love Maryland and the Eastern Shore." 4th big picture note is that slavery changes over time, especially in the mid-1800s. The international slave trade has been outlawed. It's happening illegally, but not nearly on the level that it used to. The tobacco industry that used to dominate the Eastern Shore of Maryland has crashed and collapsed. Agriculture is now a matter of wheat and grains. That takes much less labor than tobacco. The cotton gin has arrived in the South. That requires much more labor. Slave owners in the South can no longer rely on the international slave trade to bring in labor. So they look at places like the Delmarva Peninsula, where there is excess enslaved labor, to try and buy. So all of that stability that lasted for a long, long time is gone. At the same time, there's just a big religious awakening among a significant portion of the white community, particularly Methodists and Quakers. Opposition to slavery among them is on the rise. Many of them, a good number, are manumitting or setting free their enslaved peoples. Others are allowing their enslaved people to earn money by renting their services to other farms and things like that, and keeping some of the money, and then buying their own freedom in self-liberation. So a long, stable situation is in tumult. There is a great terror among the enslaved population of being sold down to the South. When that happens, those people are never seen again, torn apart from their families. Back to the stories. Now let's talk about Harriet Tubman and the power of faith. There is one building in particular where you can really kind of walk in her footsteps. It is in a little crossroads. It's not even a town anymore. It used to be a town. It's not a town anymore. A little crossroads known as Bucktown. And it is the Bucktown Village Store. Tubman was born Araminta Ross. She lives on, was born off of a place called Harrisville Road. It was the opposite of Frederick Douglass's situation. Her family was intact, and she was able to know and love them. It was a large family. It's kind of a complicated story in which the owner of Tubman's mother is a minor, and therefore the executor of the estate has control of the enslaved people, which he also owns Tubman's father. So the family is able to live together for an extended period of time. But when that minor owner comes of age, that all changes. And we get here to the worst of America for Harriet Tubman. 3 of her sisters in 2 separate occasions are sold to the South in the worst imaginable kind of way, where literally wagons of people are coming to their cabin and tearing sobbing sisters away from the family and loading them on cabins and sending them south, where they are never seen again. The mother and the children are moved away from their beloved father to this town called Bucktown. The historian Jean Humez has just a wonderful analogy that really describes beautifully what it is, why it is that Tubman would come to devote the rest of her life to freedom, particularly freedom for her family and other loved ones, although she helped many other people to freedom as well. She calls her the Humpty Dumpty child, who was always trying to put her family together again. One day in Bucktown, she was assigned to visit the Bucktown store. The building that stands there looks like it was probably standing in Tubman's time. In fact, it's probably a building that was built shortly after the Civil War on the exact same foundation as a store that was there in Tubman's time. So it really is, when you're walking in there, you're walking in the footsteps of this keystone moment in her life. She had been working with this thing called flax. I don't know much about flax. I know what I read is that it's really dirty, messy work. Tubman is early adolescence, and like early adolescence across every generation, she is concerned about her appearance. She wraps a shawl or a towel around her head because she's embarrassed about how her hair looks, and she goes into the store. She finds herself in the middle of a mess. A man, an overseer on a nearby farm, is chasing a young enslaved boy who has run away, not in the sense of running away to freedom along the Underground Railroad, but he was in trouble and he was just running away from trouble, even though there was no hope of really escaping the trouble. It was a panic, fight or flight reaction. That overseer ordered the adolescent Araminta Ross, Harriet Tubman, to hold the boy for her, and she declined. She said no, in what is the first known act of defiance against slave authority in her life. The overseer would pick up a little 2-pound hardware store weight that they used to put on the scales to figure out how much goods weighed, and threw it at the fleeing boy and hit Tubman in the head instead. She very nearly died. Her recovery would take years. She always said that their scarf saved my life, the thing she had wrapped around her head before she got hit with that weight. The historian Kate Clifford Larson did a magnificent bit of detective work, because even after she recovered largely physically from this head injury, Tubman heard voices. She saw visions. She suffered from narcolepsy. She would fall asleep out of the blue at random times for extended periods. She is rightly and very, very justly renowned for her resourcefulness, costumes, tricks, little white lies. There were 2 or 3 occasions when she had nothing up her sleeve, and she was in big trouble while leading people to freedom. In those times, she listened to the voices in her head, or she fell asleep and paid attention to the dreams that passed through her mind and decided what to do based on those things, because she believed deep down that those voices and those visions were communications from God. Let me give you an example of how this worked. In 1857, her parents were in trouble. Her parents are not slaves anymore. They have been freed. But they are almost certainly running an Underground Railroad station, and they are about to get, the rumors are rampant that they are about to get arrested for aiding enslaved people. Tubman wants to come to her rescue. She is, as she is so often during the course of her life, flat broke. She does not have a penny. She finds her way to the New York City office of the Anti-Slavery Society, where she knows a gentleman. This is from a biography of Tubman written during her lifetime by Sarah Bradford. When she received an intimation in some mysterious or supernatural way that the old people were in trouble and needed her, she asked the Lord where she should go for money so that she could go get them. She was in some way directed to the office of a certain gentleman, a friend of the slaves in New York. When she left the house, she said, I'm going to Mr. So-and-so's office, and I ain't going to leave there, and I ain't going to eat, and I ain't going to drink till I get money enough to take me after the old people. She went into the gentleman's office. How do you do, Harriet? Harriet, what do you want? Was the first greeting. I want some money, sir. You do? How much do you want? I want $20, sir. $20? Who told you to come here for $20? The Lord told me to come here, sir. He did. Well, I think the Lord's mistaken this time. No, sir, the Lord is never mistaken. Anyhow, I'm going to sit here till I get it. She does not know all that happened, for deep sleep fell upon her, one of the terms of somnolency to which she has always been subject. But her story was whispered from one to another in the office, and as her name and exploits were well known to many persons, the sympathy of those visitors to the office during the day were aroused. At all events, when she came to consciousness at last, she found herself the happy possessor of $60, the contribution of those strangers. She went on her way rejoicing to bring her old parents from the land of bondage. The title of that journey in my book of Underground Railroads journeys is God Works in Mysterious Ways. It's another interesting contrast with Frederick Douglass. Douglass was not all that religious. His faith was in a very sort of intellectual and much less visceral way. Someone complained when I gave one of these talks in person, and there was feedback, which I dearly miss, immediate feedback with an audience, sort of made the observation that sometimes focusing on these visions and these voices make it seem like Harriet Tubman didn't do anything and that God did everything for her. And another woman jumped in before I could even formulate a response, very passionately, to say, basically, do you know how much courage it takes to heed the voice of God? And do you know how much instinct and intelligence it takes to discern the voice of God amid the jumble of thoughts in our human monkey brains? I didn't need to answer that other woman's question after she jumped in like that. We're going to jump from Tubman to Douglass a couple more times. There's a famous town on the Eastern Shore. It's a big tourist town now. It's called St. Michael's. The road there is Route 33. And if you ever travel that road, or if you have traveled that road, you've passed a sign that says this highway dedicated to Frederick Douglass. Now you see those signs all over the country, and I assume all over the world for our foreign visitors here, that kind of sign. It's my opinion that there is no sign anywhere else in the world that is more appropriate and more fitting than Route 33 to be dedicated to Frederick Douglass. And that's what this story is about. I mentioned that Douglass's story is the ultimate up by your bootstraps, kind of all-American tale. Opposite again of Tubman, he, even after getting to the Lloyd plantation, he had this kind of endlessly rotating series of owners and caregivers. There was no stability, sort of family stability whatsoever in his life. When his owner, Aaron Anthony, died, he was inherited by the husband of one of Anthony's daughters, a guy named Thomas Auld. Thomas Auld then shipped him off to Baltimore at the age of 9-ish, I believe, where he lived with Thomas Auld's brother, Hugh Auld. Sophia Auld, Thomas's wife, treated him, had never had an enslaved kid in the home before, and treated him like a free kid and started to teach him she taught him the letters of the alphabet. She was starting to teach him how to read. They did not get very far before her husband learned what was going on and put a stop to it in no uncertain terms. It's so incredible to me, that rudimentary knowledge of the alphabet, how Frederick Douglass turned that into growing up to become a spectacular, spectacular writer. One of the things that he did, he writes about in his autobiography. So he's living in Baltimore in this area of Fells Point, the shipbuilding center. And there's, white kids and black kids all running around. And a ship would go by. And he would ask the white kids, what was the name on the name board on the back of the ship? And sometimes they would tell him. And when they would tell him, he would study that name board and then scratch the letters into the dirt, trying to put together which letters were associated with which sounds. That's kind of the level at which his up by the bootstraps self-education happened. And when he finds his way to freedom, he is so sort of eloquent and erudite that many people do not believe he is a former slave. They think that he's a scam artist trying to pass himself off as a former slave. So that roller coaster ride that started back on Tuckahoe Creek in Baltimore, he kind of liked life with the Alds in Baltimore, and he was kind of back up at the top. But he was brought back down to the bottom. There was a spat, a family spat, and Thomas Auld ends up bringing him back to St. Michael's. And now this city boy is in this one-horse town on the Eastern Shore, which he hates. Like any adolescent boy, this is when, like adolescent kids today, this is the period in his life when he first tries to reach out in a sort of adult manner and help people, right? A free Black man learns that he knows how to read, asks him to teach other Blacks in St. Michael's how to read. Like many adolescents, he does this in a naive way. He does not keep it secret. It does not go well. The first official reading class that he is leading is broken up by a small mob of white men with sticks and other weapons, saying in no uncertain terms that this educational initiative was a no-go. Thomas Auld, his owner, owned a store where the post office in St. Michael's was located. These people who came with sticks and bricks and whatever else to break up the reading class, they're his customers. They're giving him a lot of pressure about what to do about this uppity city boy, Black kid who's trying to teach their slaves how to read. Thomas Auld does discipline Frederick Douglass. He sent him to a renowned slave breaker named Stephen Covey. This is Covey's specialty, is taking difficult, young, enslaved people and fixing them. He's very good at what he does. As a writer, I really enjoy Douglass's description of Covey. He has a wolfish face and a voice that emerged from the side of his mouth in a light growl like a dog when an attempt is made to take a bone from him. There's all kinds of things that happen on the Covey farm. Covey puts this city boy in charge of a few thousand pounds of oxen and a wagon and sends him off with no training. Douglass ends up breaking a fence for which he gets whipped unmercifully. This kind of thing, it's like the worst of slavery. When Douglass becomes Douglass later and is giving abolitionist speeches in the North, there was often a dramatic moment where he would remove his shirt and show the whip marks on his back. Many of those were the work of Stephen Covey. Covey did his job. Douglass recalls that his experience with this part of the worst of America left him broken in body, soul, and spirit. And that uproarious boy who, even through his early travails with slavery, had always passionately pointed forward, learning to read and engage, and had no goals anymore whatsoever. This all came to a head in August of the year that Douglass spent with Covey. It was harvest time. It was hot. Douglass collapsed, presumably from heat stroke. Teenage boy, again, collapsed from heat stroke. Covey was having none of it and brutalized him while he was suffering from heat stroke. That road, the highway that's dedicated to Frederick Douglass. Douglass ends up running away. He runs. Oh, wait. Let me back up 1 second because I forgot the key part. When he recovers from this heat stroke, the next day is a Sunday, and in kind of a grisly little detail, Covey doesn't discipline his enslaved people. Wait a minute, I'm sorry, I got mixed up here. I had an error in my notes. Let me go back. So he runs away after this heat stroke incident. He runs away and he walks all the way down this Route 33 from the Covey farm to St. Michael's to beg his owner, Thomas Auld, to take him away from Stephen Covey. And Thomas Auld sends him right back. And so he's got to walk down Route 33, what is now Route 33. And he's got to walk right back to the Covey farm. Along the way, he kind of takes his time and spends a night in the woods with a guy named Sandy, a rare character in those days in that he was a first-generation African. Sandy helped him out, gave him a pep talk. He actually went out in the woods and gave him a little root that he dug up and said that it would bring him strength and luck. When Douglass returned, it was on a Sunday, and Covey did nothing because it was the Sabbath. But on Monday morning, he took Douglass out to the barn with a whip and commenced trying to beat him. And for whatever reason, that kid who was beaten in body, soul, and spirit, he had that root in his pocket. Who knows? He fought back. And in Douglass's autobiography, it makes it sound like this hours-long scene out of some John Wayne movie that went on and on and on. The end result of their fight between the slave breaker and Douglass was that the fight was a draw, that Covey never really laid a finger on Douglass. Douglass is walking away from that fight, says, however long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed forever when I could be a slave in fact. The aftermath is interesting. After his term ran out at the end of the year, Douglass's owner sent him to another farm, the Freedland farm, which had a reputation for treating slaves well by the standards of the time. He called Mr. Freedland the best master I had until I became my own master. But he was committed to freedom by this point, and he planned to escape on Easter Sunday. He had 4 or 5 compatriots. One of them betrayed the game. They were all caught on the Saturday before Easter Sunday. A whole bunch of white guys rode up on horses and arrested these people who were planning to escape. So he's got to take the long walk from St. Michael's to the town I mentioned earlier, Easton. All along Route 33, this highway is dedicated to Frederick Douglass. He is in jail there. He thinks that he is going to be sold to the South. Slave dealers are coming in, measuring his biceps and his thighs and doing kind of disgusting things like that. He walks, but Thomas Auld comes to get him after 4 or 5 days, and they walk back down Route 33 towards St. Michael's. The only indication of why Auld brought him back instead of Ben Ross, Harriet Tubman's father, actually all of the time that his children are present, he puts a blindfold on and wraps it around. And he does this so that when the authorities come to him and ask him if he's seen his three sons, he can say honestly, no, I haven't seen them. Tubman's devotion to family, lots of elements of cleverness in this, but there's still something so totally heartbreaking, even here, I mean, here in the Christmas season. The reason why they didn't tell the mother is because they didn't think that she could handle it. The woman who was so strong with Moses, now maybe she's a little bit older, but whatever, her children have decided that she can't handle the departure of her sons, even the departure to freedom. She can't handle the sight of her daughter Harriet because it's going to be such a brief meeting. And so they don't tell her. And it always sort of is heartbreaking to me to think of Harriet Tubman's mother making that Christmas dinner and then no one shows up. And then presumably her husband just sort of lies to her about it and tells her that he didn't see them. Now, I am happy to report, as I mentioned, her parents got in a little trouble. Harriet Tubman raced down from the north to save them, rescue them. They all ended up in Canada and in upstate New York, where there were happy reunions with all of those children. The last story that I want to tell you is one of reconciliation. Harriet Tubman never came back to Maryland after the Civil War. She didn't have much of a need to. The Humpty Dumpty child had brought all of her siblings, except the three sisters sold down south, had come back and gotten all of her siblings, in addition to quite a few other people. There was one sister that was kind of the one that got away for her, her sister Rachel. She made a number of attempts to get Rachel. And then Rachel tragically died young before any of those attempts could succeed. Frederick Douglass came back a bunch of times. I mentioned his Easton visit. He also visited Baltimore, he visited Cambridge, he visited a lot of towns on the Eastern Shore, frequently giving speeches in Black churches. In 1877, he arrived in St. Michael's, the town along Route 33, where the highway is dedicated to him, on a steamship called Matilda at Navy Point, which, for those of you who know the area, is where the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum is today. He is at this point an elder statesman with that shock of white hair, the formal garb. He has newspaper reporters in tow. There are lots of rumors that he is going to run for the United States Senate. So there's intense interest at this time in him. So a little flashback to Douglass's firebrand anti-slavery days when slavery was still existing and he was barnstorming across the North, giving speeches in opposition to slavery. He was also running a newspaper and writing frequent things for all kinds of publications. He wrote a famous thing called Letter to a Slave Master to Thomas Auld, the owner with whom he had a very complicated relationship. I intend to make use of you as a weapon with which to assail the system of slavery, as a means of bringing this guilty nation with yourself to repentance. Now, there is no question, I don't think, in anyone's mind, but that Frederick Douglass was on the right side of history when it came to the fight against slavery. The question that popped up in his mind was, did he take it too far on a couple of occasions? In that letter to a slave master, he had accused Thomas Auld of mistreating his beloved grandmother, who made that walk past Rabbit Hill Road and Route 50 with the young boy in hand and putting him over his shoulder. Said that he had abandoned her in her old age when she could no longer work and kind of left her out in the cold. That accusation was unjust. Now, his grandmother didn't end up in a fancy assisted living facility, but by the standards of the time, Thomas Auld had lived up to his obligations to make sure she was fed and sheltered during her old age when she could no longer work. There's another sort of accusation. There's a couple of things where Douglass stretched the truth while fighting the good fight. One of the reasons why he wants to come down to St. Michael's is because he has heard that Thomas Auld is on his deathbed. He gives a speech to a mixed audience of whites and blacks while he's in St. Michael's, but the real reason he's there is to go visit Auld before he dies. The building is now known as the Dodson House B&B. It's on Cherry Street. He is allowed inside the front door, which, sad to say, is kind of regarded as a magnanimous gesture on the part of the Auld family to let a black man, even a man of the stature of Frederick Douglass, to walk in the front door. He gets up and to see the bedridden Thomas Auld. At this point, Douglass is the Marshal of Washington, D.C., an appointed position by the president. And they have a very formal greeting. Auld used to be a waterman, so it's Captain Auld, Marshal Douglass. What Douglass proceeds to do is apologize to Auld on his deathbed for stretching the truth about the grandmother. He pays a price for this. All across the South, there's newspapers in tow, newspaper reporters in tow here, and they're kind of watching this, and all of the Southern newspapers run this cartoon that has the great Frederick Douglass on his knees begging the forgiveness of his former master. The New York Times editorialized Mr. Douglass's role as a leader of his race is about played out. To his credit, Douglass pretty much ignored all of the media nonsense that went around that moment of apology. The key moment that he talks about in his autobiography is this exchange. He asked Auld how he felt when he got the news that he, Douglass, had escaped slavery from Baltimore. Auld replies, "Frederick, I always knew you were too smart to be a slave. Had I been in your place, I probably should have done as you did. Captain Auld, I am glad to hear you say this. I did not run away from you. I ran away from slavery. It was not that I loved Caesar less, but Rome more." There comes a point when you're writing books when it's time to stop reading and researching and actually put your butt in the chair and start typing. I was at that point with the 5 or 6 Douglass stories that are contained in Tubman Travels. When I came down the stairs one morning and he'd been on my mind for weeks and weeks and weeks, I turned to my wife and I'm just like, what a decent man. After all he had been through, the scars on his back, the fractured family situation, the slave breaker, the having to run away, the fighting against teaching himself to read, the becoming one of the best known men in the country, becoming a spectator, all that he had accomplished. And he hears that Thomas Auld is dying, and what he thinks is, I better go apologize to that SOB. I mistreated him once. Unbelievable, isn't it? What a decent man. Glorious things in inglorious times. So I'm going to close. Harriet Tubman wrote, I mentioned Sarah Bradford wrote those as told to biographies, 2 of them of Tubman. And you know how on the back of a book, there's like, so-and-so famous person thinks this is a good book. They used to do that in a more extended fashion back then with extended sort of letters of recommendation appearing in the front of a book. Harriet Tubman asked Frederick Douglass if he would be kind enough to write a letter for her. And what he did was write what is, in my opinion, the greatest letter of reference in the history of mankind. Dear Harriet, I am glad to know that the story of your eventful life has been written by a kind lady, and that the same is soon to be published. You ask for what you do not need when you call upon me for a word of commendation. I need such words from you far more than you can need them from me, especially where your superior labors and devotion to the cause of the lately enslaved of our land are known as I know them. The difference between us is very marked. Most that I have done and suffered in the service of our cause has been in public, and I have received much encouragement at every step of the way. You, on the other hand, labored in a private way, I have wrought in the day, you in the night. I have had the applause of the crowd and the satisfaction that comes of being approved by the multitude, while the most that you have done has been witnessed by a few trembling, scarred, and footsore bondmen and women who you have led out of the house of bondage, and whose heartfelt God bless you has been your only reward. The midnight sky and the silent stars have been the witness of your devotion to freedom and of your heroism. Excepting John Brown of secret memory, I know of no one who has willingly encountered more perils and hardships to serve our enslaved people than you have. Much that you have done would seem improbable to those who do not know you as I know you. It is to me a great pleasure and a great privilege to bear testimony for your character and your works, and to say to those to whom you may come that I regard you in every way truthful and trustworthy, your friend, Frederick Douglass. I also find it so fabulous that these two very, very different champions of freedom, illiteracy, literacy, faith, not so much faith, intellectual and instinctual and following visions, thanks to this head injury, that these two very different people were so filled with respect for each other at the end of their life. That's my show. I hope you enjoyed the stories. I thank you for hanging out.
Bravo, Jim. That was awesome. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. So let's see. We had some technical problems at the beginning of the session where my screen froze. So let me go back and go over a few things we might have missed. Hold on for 1 second. And if you have any questions, you can let us know in the chat or the Q&A. And Jim and I will knock those out in just a second. So bear with me for one moment. So Jim, how did you get involved in writing books in the first place? Is that, or is that one of those? Well, that's a really long story.
No. It's
I was stuck in traffic on the Beltway, and
that's part of the story. It's actually a short story. My wife and I moved from Baltimore to the Eastern Shore of Maryland in Cambridge in 2004. I was on my own as a writer. So I had a lot of business back in Baltimore. It soon became a pretty big mission in my life to have to go back to the big cities less and to enjoy Delmarva more. These books, series of books and Secrets of the Eastern. My wife's a photographer. We make Christmas cards. We sell her pictures. So this whole Secrets of the Eastern Shore endeavor is in part a trick to not have to go back to the other side anymore. One of the interesting things that happened, right after we moved, I'm an old newspaper guy, so I picked up the local newspaper and I saw there was a meeting of a group of local citizens called the Harriet Tubman Discussion Group. I did not know much about Tubman when I arrived in Cambridge. I proceeded to get very obsessed and was a regular at these meetings run by a historian. Some of you may have heard of John Creighton, a spectacular man, and Pat Lewis, his partner. I never thought I was writing a book. I was just doing it because I was interested in it. And then one morning I woke up and decided to write a book. It was very weird.
Wow. What about, so you've actually written more than one.
Yeah, so I got 4 books. The first book that I did was the first Eastern Shore road trips. Tubman Travels was the second. That's the period where I was, I didn't know what my second book was going to be. And then one morning I just woke up and started outlining my Tubman book. And I still don't know. It was kind of like what must have happened to Harriet Tubman when she had her narcoleptic episodes, because I just woke up and I'm like, oh, this is the book I'm going to write. I don't know.
Oh, okay. So these are the slides that got stuck when I was trying to scroll through this earlier. So Jim manages the Facebook page, Secrets of the Eastern Shore. And then as far as the other books go, Eastern Shore Road Trips, 27 one-day adventures on Delmarva, and Eastern Road Trips #2, 26 more one-day adventures on Delmarva. And then the book that Jim, this just came out a few days ago, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, about 10 days ago.
Oh, okay. Maybe you can come back sometime in the future and talk about that one.
And tell fun stories of life and people on Delmarva. I'm always game for that.
And then what about, as far as like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, do you find there's like a common misconception about them, or thing that people are, oh, I thought she, such and such, but actually that's not the case. You talked a lot about her spirituality, and she overcame the head injury and
Yeah.
things like that. I think a lot of people aren't aware that her sisters were sold into um,
Right.
down
For
south.
those, for those of you who've seen the movie, the Hollywood movie, I thought they actually did a pretty good job with this notion of her faith and the voices and the visions. But the most shocking thing to me was that they did not include in the story the Bucktown store and Bucktown store incident that I told. I think they did a good job with the movie.
Yeah, that's such an important part of her early life.
Yeah.
Interesting that they missed out on that one. Let's see. So someone asked a question earlier. It was Christine. Do we know how Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman first met?
It is very unlikely that they met up north. Tubman first was in Canada for a long time and eventually settled in Auburn, New York. Douglass is barnstorming at that time. Tubman is becoming increasingly famous. He's also helping escape slaves as they come. So he is also part of the Underground Railroad network. And it is in that abolition world that they first met. But I am unaware of anybody who knows like a date and a place for their actual first meeting.
Yeah, I notice sometimes with history, they, if you go back and read autobiographies of people from 100 years ago, or sometimes the things that they emphasize and is different than it would be today, or things that they leave out, like, oh, how would you not mention something like that? So kind of funny to go back and read historical autobiographies of people like Frederick Douglass and others too.
Yeah,
kind of see how things are. And a lot of people don't realize Frederick Douglass actually lived in Washington, D.C. for a number of years. In the latter years of his life, and you can actually go visit his home in Washington, D.C.
Yep. Yeah.
Let's see. Let me look through the questions. So a lot of people are saying thanks. They're planning on going out and visiting these sites. Someone asked, what is Delmarva again? So we were talking about that earlier. Let me go back to that slide.
Yeah. So there's a peninsula. The eastern shore of Maryland is across the Chesapeake Bay in that kind of orangey color. That whole peninsula, there's parts of 3 states, and those states are Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia. So Delmarva, the abbreviations of the states, is how it came to be called the Delmarva Peninsula.
Yeah, we're right here in Washington, D.C. Here, Jim said, here's Delaware, here's Maryland, there's Virginia. Let's see. Oh, so someone earlier asked what you thought of the Harriet Tubman movies. He just kind of talked about that a little bit ago. I did, they got mostly good reviews. Some people that are serious historians had some issues with the portrayal of some of the events, but I guess overall, my personal opinion, I'll chime in. I thought it captured kind of the essence of who Harriet Tubman was, and yeah, there was kind of some Hollywoodization of some of the stuff, but if you just look at the overall film from start to finish, I felt like it kind of captured her essence as a person and her courage, and you talked about it early in your program how resourceful she was at coming up with solutions when these problems that arise, and something we can all be inspired by, the fact that, hey, life doesn't always turn out the way we expect it to, and you kind of have to come up with plan B or plan C or plan even D and E sometimes as well.
Yeah.
The film was just called Harriet.
I agree with you about the movie. Your description of the movie is very good. There were things that are just like, wait, that didn't quite happen that way, but they stayed true in that. They stayed true to her spirit. I think they did a good job of staying true to her spirit.
What about, are there any other people that you feature in your book besides Harriet Tubman and Frederick? I know there's other people in your book, but are there any that people would be familiar with?
A white guy, Thomas Garrett, in Delaware, very famous.
Oh yeah, conductor of the Underground Railroad.
He is probably the most famous. The book is about 1/3 Tubman, 1/3 Douglass, and 1/3 kind of other stories of freedom seekers from other places on the Delmarva Peninsula. And most of those other people get a self-contained one story. Tubman and Douglas have 8, 9 stories each. And then the other ones are 9 different people, each with an individual story and a place attached to it of their journey to freedom.
Oh.
But nobody famous on the level of Tubman and Douglas, no.
Okay, yeah, they're the 2 superstars of the Underground Railroad. What about, how did you go about writing this book? Like, what was the research process? You mentioned how you got started. You went to the history meetings and things like that. So for people that aren't familiar with writing a book, what was that process like?
Yeah, it kind of worked. It kind of worked in the reverse, because I quickly developed this personal passion through these people in the Harriet Tubman discussion group, which is just a fabulous small town thing, kind of equally integrated Black and white people. The one lead historian is a Black guy, as a white guy, and the other lead historian is a Black woman. They together uncovered lots of the details that have come to the fore in the last 20 years, and they were really dedicated to community history in Harriet Tubman's birthplace, and they were always sharing at these meetings all of their latest finds and things like that. So if I had come to the topic cold, I would have gone to them for help living where I live and live, but I didn't need to do that, because by that point I'd been sitting in their meetings for years and years, and they have handouts and passing them out. And other than that, it's a lot of reading and thinking. It's not rocket science, especially given what I do is kind of spend time in these dense historical tomes, digging into like the footnotes and doing all that. And then I kind of come out, like, as I describe myself, more of a storyteller than a historian. I come out from that fabulous work that other people have done, and that I always try and credit, and sort of tell an engaging story that doesn't require all those footnotes and all that dense language.
Okay. I personally liked your book because I'm not a native of this area. I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan, and it was great because I can't show it on the screen, but you have a lot of maps in your book. So for people that are venturing out here, and it might be a little bit harder to find your way around if you're a city type person and you're venturing off into the Eastern Shore. So it was really good that you had so many maps in your books to kind of and help also visualize the places that you were talking about. What about another thing that was different about your book was the order that the stories were in? Can you talk about that?
Yeah. I actually have 2 alternate table of contents in there. So they are actually ordered on a geographical journey from place to place, going to each news story is associated with the place. And then you go, 8, 10 miles, and there's another place. And then you go 12 miles, and there's another place and another place. And the main orientation of the 32 journeys is a geographical journey in which you, the reader, are following physically out there, following in the footsteps on the road, perhaps with this book in your glove compartment or whatever. The alternate table of contents goes chronologically through Tubman's life and chronologically through Douglas's life, and then has the kind of random other 8 or 9 stories that are there. So each story is actually is self-contained. You can jump into that was my goal. You can jump into any one story about Tubman or Douglas without necessarily needing to do the whole sequence.
Yeah, because this is a big geographical area. This isn't like walking around Baltimore. No. This is hundreds and hundreds of square miles. And so if someone is out here with their book, driving around the countryside, visiting these places, it's nice that you have it set up in kind of that geographic format, so that someone can, I'm here at the Bucktown store learning about Harriet Tubman. What else is close by that I can go check out? Makes it easier for as opposed to, the next stop in our story is 200 miles away. So
it makes it easier. My goal is to make it easier for somebody in Washington or Baltimore who's going to be like in the area around a town called Denton to pick up the book and say, okay, what's nearby that I can go follow in some Underground Railroad footsteps, and do 3 of them that time. And then maybe they're going somewhere else the next year and they can do 3 or 4 in that area.
Oh, okay. Someone asked, actually a couple people had questions about the Eastern Shore terminology. What exactly does that refer to? So we'll go back to our map and pull that up. Yeah. Okay, so for someone not familiar with the area, what exactly is the Eastern Shore?
the blue in the middle of Maryland, that little orangey, whatever color. I'm a little colorblind. Forgive me if I'm getting it wrong, but the orangey thing.
Okay, right here.
The blue water in the middle, that is the Chesapeake Bay. And so most of Maryland and most people in Maryland are on the western shore of the Chesapeake Bay.
Okay, over
Where
here.
the Baltimore dot is.
Okay.
The eastern shore simply refers to that little kind of, right there.
Okay.
And it's simply a geographical description that it's on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay as opposed to the western shore.
Okay, because that was another question someone asked. They said, is Delaware and the tip of Virginia part of the eastern shore, or is it just Maryland? So it sounds like it's
Virginia has
whole thing.
Virginia has the same thing going on with most
right here.
State in the West. So it is also called the Eastern Shore in Virginia, and it is Delaware is kind of a self-contained thing. So it's interesting. Delaware isn't really Eastern Shore, and yet Delawareans really embrace the culture of the Eastern Shore, even if Delaware, the name thing is just kind of weird when it comes to Delaware.
But yet they don't call this the Western Shore, I don't think, do they? You hear Eastern Shore quite a bit, but I don't recall hearing people talk about the Western Shore. Maybe they do, I don't know.
Yeah.
And then let's see, let me go back and pull up something else. 1 second. Hold on. One of the things that's really striking about this area for me is really great natural beauty. And it's not a very developed area. So it's really rural and a lot of waterways and marshes and forests and things like that. And I was mentioning earlier, it hasn't changed all that much. You can really kind of visualize Harriet Tubman passing through here and people escaping and things like that, as opposed to sometimes when you visit a historical site, you really have to kind of use your imagination to visualize what it would have looked at that point in time that you're referring back to, but not so much here, just because it is still very rural and you can just kind of vision her passing through these areas. What about, how did they communicate? How did Harriet Tubman communicate with these people? That was something that another person asked, how would she get in contact with these people when she went down back to Maryland? Just knock on their door in the middle of the night, or was some other way to send messages?
Okay, that's one of the things they did. They did a pretty good job of in the movie, was kind of depict the network of free and enslaved African-American mariners who worked the boats and built the boats that traveled all these waterways, which were, of course, the superhighways of the time, and how they would function like a human telegraph or telephone line, getting word to people in the north because they were taking shipments up to Philadelphia or to Baltimore, where they would, a game of telephone and pass that along. And also over land, they had the network of Underground Railroad conductors and station masters. And so people would come along and they would spread news about their neighbors and things. And there was a surreptitious, Booker T. Washington in his thing tells a really funny story about how the African Americans would have to go to the post office in the plantation where he grew up to get the mail. And they would hear all the white people talking in the post office. And by the time they got home, all the black people in the area knew all of the local news before the guy who was getting the letters actually got any of the news. It was like that.
What about, I saw this on your Facebook page. You were talking about people can actually walk part of this Underground Railroad trail. Can you tell us a little bit about that? It's not that you don't necessarily have to drive the whole way.
The woman on the left is Linda Harris, and she kind of out of the blue a few years ago decided to walk the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Byway. That is another great source, by the way. If you Google Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Byway, there's all kinds of online sites and information about sites and stories and things like that. They do a fabulous job. She walked that official byway, a couple hundred miles over the course of a week or whatever it was. She actually, and then she's become very active in Cambridge. She's from Washington, I believe. She's a jazz musician. She's become very active in Cambridge. She does like a monthly concert series now. Christmas Eve, she is doing another walk, like a 10-mile walk, kind of Christmas Eve gratitude walk that people are invited to come, and it supports one of the local little museums or charities, I forget which. So yes, there have been people who came down and decided to get their walking stick and basically walk along these country roads all along the byway.
Yeah, someone asked what kind of land is this? Is it parks or state or so? It's a variety. So some of these lands are private. They're still active farms. I mean, if you look over here on the right, this is a active farm. There's some spots where the trails go through public parks and lands and things like that. So it's kind of a mix, but I think, Jim, would be fair to say that most of it you're walking through like private lands, just because this is a rural, active, still agrarian community for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily walking. I mean, you're driving 2-lane roads, a lot of 2-lane roads, and pulling off either at a marker or a spot or a little park or that kind of thing.
And then this is the famous mural that they put up. I think that's now been up for 3 years, I think.
Yeah, 3 years. It really has been fabulous. So that,
real tourist attraction.
If you're curious about coming Harriet Tubman, you got to see the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Visitor Center out in the countryside outside of my town of Cambridge. And this mural, which you can see is done, I never know how to pronounce the words, of the trompe style. It just is really a moving experience that you can just feels like you can just reach out and touch your hand as depicted in that picture. And people come from far and wide to see that mural. It's done by an artist who lives in my county of Dorchester County named Michael Rosado. He has been doing murals all over the Eastern Shore. There's a thing called the Michael Rosado Mural Trail where you can look up what all of the rest. There's Michael. Anyway, just a fabulous guy. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So here's the mural. It's Jim's referring to it. So there's 2 Harriet Tubman museums. There's one that's in Cambridge, a private run museum. And then there's another one that's run by the National Park Service in the state of Maryland. So this is on the private Harriet Tubman Museum I'm not sure if I should say it downtown Cambridge, but it's in the city.
It's in downtown Cambridge. The community group that runs it has like incredibly deep roots in trying to bring the Tubman story to life. So the National Park Service and the Maryland Department of Natural Resources have their big museum, and they do a great job. This little museum is run by community volunteers, and the roots of those community volunteers go back to like the 1970s, and a woman named Addie Clash, who's back in the 1970s and 1980s, Harriet Tubman was a subject fit mainly for children's books.
Oh, really? Wow.
There was no learning about Harriet Tubman in school during African American History Month while you're traveling on the Eastern Shore or any of that. That all built up slowly but surely, particularly in the 90s and early 2000s. So this community group has been fighting since way back when to get her story to the forefront. So that's just to pay justice to all those generations of people who have worked to put that together, is well worth a visit to.
Oh, yeah.
But really great. And they have some wonderful people there. Linda, you might run into the walker, Linda Douglass, that we showed a picture of earlier, and a bunch of other community volunteers.
Yeah, then this is the other museum that you were referring to. This is the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Visitor Center. This site is run by the National Park Service in the state of Maryland, and they also have excellent displays. So you can go see all this stuff. If you pick up Jim's book, you can go check out all this stuff. And our group has done day trips out here from Washington, D.C., but there's just so much. I mean, you can see a lot in a day, but I don't know how long, Jim, how long would it take for someone to see all the sites in your book? Probably like a week.
You could easily take a week.
Because you can see a lot in a day, but you can only see a handful of sites, and there's quite a few designated spots.
If you kind of did it in fast motion, maybe a long weekend. But I think most people do it in spots. They're kind of frequent travelers to the Eastern Shore, and they'll do a few spots on one weekend and a few spots on another weekend.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see. Well, we're getting close to the end of our program. If anyone else has any questions, you can let us know. Someone asked, They said, realize you just finished your latest book, but what's your next project? Have you had a chance to think about that just yet?
I do actually. I've been thinking. I've been thinking a lot about it for quite some time. What I'm going to try to do, I don't know if I'll succeed. What I am going to try and do is tell stories from days gone by of lives of people on the Delmarva Peninsula, this sort of rural and still even somewhat isolated and insulated area. I'm going to try and tell stories that have direct, that I feel have direct things to teach us about our lives today. Does that make sense?
Yeah, tell us a little more though.
Oh, gosh.
Let me go back and here, I'll pull up your books again. So as mentioned earlier, we're with Jim Duffy, our special guest, an author, historian, and storyteller. And he is the manager of the Secrets of the Eastern Shore website on Facebook. And also the previous books that he's written, Eastern Shore Road Trips, 27 one-day adventures on Delmarva, and Eastern Road Trips #2, 26 more one-day adventures on Delmarva. And then his new book is, you wouldn't believe, 44 strange and wondrous Delmarva tales. But then, of course, today we were talking about this one, Tubman Travels, 32 Underground Railroad Journeys on Delmarva, a Secrets of the Eastern Shore Guide. So, well, I think that does it for today. Jim, thanks so much for coming and joining us and sharing your knowledge about Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad and Delmarva and the Eastern Shore and et cetera, et cetera. Love to have you come back at some point in time and talk about your new book. If you're available, I'll circle back with you on that offline. If anyone joined us late, we recorded this program. It'll be on our YouTube page. It might not be loaded though until sometime tomorrow. So again, thanks everyone for joining us. Have a great rest of your Saturday and stay safe. Jim, any final thoughts?
I just want to thank everybody who's in there. I'm actually doing this in a large conference room in the Dorchester County Innovation Center, where I kind of have a temporary office access.
Wow.
And I wish you were all in this room so we could have more give and take. Zoom is what it is, but
we'll come see you in person someday.
I'm so grateful that you came.
Post-COVID, we'll come see you in person someday.
That's great.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Have a great rest of your weekend. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.